Imagine a man sitting alone in a small room, far away from the world of power he once served. Outside that room, kings are being crowned, empires are expanding, and wars are shaping the future of nations. But inside, there is only silence, ink, and a mind that refuses to forget what it has seen. This man is not a king. He is not a warrior. He is not someone history would normally celebrate. He is just a former government official who has lost everything: his position, his influence, and his place in society. And yet, strangely, this is the man whose ideas will outlive emperors, dictators, and presidents. His name is Niccolò Machiavelli. For centuries he has been painted as one of the most controversial thinkers in human history. Some describe him as cold, ruthless, and even dangerous. His name has become so powerful that a word was created from it, Machiavellian, meaning manipulation, deception, and political cruelty. But here is the question almost no one truly stops to ask: did Machiavelli actually promote evil, or did he simply describe the hidden truth of how power operates? Because when you strip away all the judgment, all the accusations, and all the interpretations, what remains is something far more uncomfortable. Machiavelli did not write from a palace. He did not write as a ruler. He wrote as someone who had been inside the system and then thrown out of it. And from that distance, he observed something most people never dare to admit. Power does not follow morality. It follows survival. His most famous work, The Prince, was not written as a celebration of corruption, but as a brutal reflection of reality. It was born in exile during a period of personal downfall, when Machiavelli had been removed from political life and stripped of influence. In that isolation, he began to study history, rulers, and human behavior, with one obsessive question in mind: why do powerful men rise, and why do they fall so quickly? And what he discovered was not comforting, it was not idealistic, it was not moral, it was real. He realized that leaders are not remembered for their goodness, but for their effectiveness, that fear often controls more than love, that appearances often matter more than truth, and that most political systems survive not on honesty, but on perception. This is why Machiavelli became so misunderstood, because he did not tell people what they wanted to hear. He told them what he saw, and sometimes truth feels more dangerous than lies. So before you judge him as a villain, before you accept the label history gave him, you need to understand the world that shaped him, the experiences that broke him, and the observations that made him immortal in political thought. Because the story of Machiavelli is not just about one man, it is about the uncomfortable truth of power itself. So today we will discuss that person, his rise and fall. Stay tuned till the end, because maybe no one else has told you this. Long before his name became associated with power, manipulation, and controversy, Niccolò Machiavelli was simply a boy, born into a world he did not control, but would one day understand better than most. He was born in 1469 in Florence, a city that looked beautiful on the surface, filled with art, culture, and intellectual brilliance. It was the heart of the Renaissance, a place where great minds were shaping the future of Europe. But beneath that beauty, there was tension, political instability, hidden rivalries, and silent power struggles were part of everyday life. Florence was not just a city of artists, it was a battlefield of influence. Machiavelli did not come from a wealthy or powerful family. His father was a lawyer, respected, but not influential enough to grant him access to elite power circles. This meant something important. Machiavelli grew up observing power from the outside, not enjoying it from within. And sometimes that distance creates sharper understanding. As a young man, he immersed himself in classical literature, studying Roman history, political systems, and the rise and fall of empires. He read about leaders who built greatness and others who lost everything overnight. But he didn't just study their victories, he studied their mistakes. He became obsessed with a deeper question: what separates those who keep power from those who lose it? Unlike many thinkers of his time, Machiavelli was not interested in idealism. He was not fascinated by how the world should work. Instead, he focused on how it actually worked. He noticed patterns, how alliances shifted quickly, how loyalty could disappear in moments, and how even the strongest leaders could fall if they misjudged human nature. Then came the turning point. In 1498, at a relatively young age, Machiavelli was appointed to a significant position in the Florentine Republic. He became a diplomat and a government official, which gave him direct access to the world he had only observed before. Now he was no longer on the outside looking in. He was inside the system, witnessing power in its rawest form. He traveled across Europe, meeting rulers, observing courts, and studying political strategies firsthand. He saw how leaders behaved behind closed doors, how decisions were made, and how quickly morality could be abandoned when power was at stake. These experiences shaped him in ways no book ever could. Because Machiavelli didn't just learn about power from history, he lived it. And what he witnessed during these early years would later become the foundation of everything he wrote. Every betrayal he saw, every alliance he analyzed, and every ruler he observed added another layer to his understanding of human behavior. This was not just the beginning of his career. This was the beginning of a mindset that would one day challenge the way the entire world understands power. For a man who started with no real influence, the rise of Niccolò Machiavelli into the heart of political power was not sudden. It was calculated, observant, and deeply earned through his understanding of the system. When he entered public service in Florence, Machiavelli was not given authority because of wealth or noble blood. He earned his place through intelligence, discipline, and an unusual ability to see what others ignored. At a time when politics was dominated by powerful families and hidden agendas, he became a key figure in the Florentine Republic, not as a ruler, but as someone who operated close enough to power to understand its mechanics. He was appointed as a senior official in the Second Chancery of Florence, a position that placed him at the center of diplomatic affairs. This role required him to travel frequently, negotiate with foreign leaders, and observe political systems beyond his own city. And it was during these missions that Machiavelli encountered something that would leave a permanent mark on his thinking: real power in action. One of the most defining moments of his career was his interaction with Cesare Borgia, a man many considered ruthless, unpredictable, and dangerously ambitious. But where others saw cruelty, Machiavelli saw something different: effectiveness. Borgia was not bound by moral hesitation. He understood fear, loyalty, and control in ways that most leaders only pretended to. He made decisions quickly, eliminated threats without delay, and maintained authority through a mix of strategy and calculated brutality. To many, he was a villain, but to Machiavelli, he was a case study. This was the moment where theory became reality. Machiavelli realized that successful leaders were not necessarily the most virtuous. They were the most adaptable. They knew when to appear kind and when to be feared. They understood that maintaining power often required actions that society would judge harshly, but history would remember as effective. As Machiavelli continued his diplomatic missions across Europe, he observed kings, generals, and political systems, each revealing a different side of power. He saw alliances formed not out of trust, but necessity. He saw promises made only to be broken when convenient. And he saw how quickly public support could shift based on perception rather than truth. But perhaps the most important realization during his rise was this: power is not stable. It is constantly moving, constantly shifting, and those who fail to adapt lose it. Machiavelli was not just rising within the political system, he was learning how fragile that system truly was. He understood that even those at the top were not safe, that control could disappear in a moment if a leader misjudged timing, people, or perception. And ironically, this deep understanding of power would not protect him, because while Machiavelli was mastering the game itself was about to turn against him. His rise gave him knowledge, but it also placed him dangerously close to a fall he never saw coming. To truly understand the mind of Niccolò Machiavelli, you cannot just study the man, you have to step into the world that shaped him, because Machiavelli did not create his ideas in isolation. They were forged in one of the most unstable and dangerous political environments in history. The Italy of his time was not a unified country. It was a fragmented collection of city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States, each fighting for dominance, each driven by ambition, fear, and survival. There was no lasting peace, no stable alliances. Power shifted constantly, and loyalty was often temporary. This was a world where rulers did not fall over decades. They fell overnight. One of the most influential forces during this time was the powerful Medici family, who controlled Florence for years. Their rule brought both stability and tension, as their dominance created enemies both inside and outside the city. When they were in power, Florence operated under their influence. When they were overthrown, chaos followed. This cycle of control and collapse became a pattern that Machiavelli witnessed closely. At the same time, foreign powers like France and Spain were constantly interfering in Italian politics. They saw Italy not as a nation, but as an opportunity, weak, divided, and easy to manipulate. Armies marched across the land, alliances were made and broken, and cities were taken and lost like pieces on a chessboard. And in the middle of all this was Florence, a city trying to survive in a world where strength was respected, but weakness was exploited immediately. Machiavelli saw leaders who tried to be moral and fair, only to be overthrown by those who were more ruthless. He saw governments that relied on trust collapse under betrayal, and he saw how quickly public opinion could turn, how easily people could be influenced, and how dangerous it was for a leader to depend only on loyalty. Religion also played a powerful role. The church was not just a spiritual authority, it was a political force. Decisions were influenced not only by strategy, but by religious power, creating a complex system where faith and politics were deeply intertwined. This added another layer of unpredictability, where leaders had to balance not just enemies and allies, but also moral expectations and public perception. In such a world, idealism was not just ineffective, it was dangerous, because a leader who refused to adapt to reality would not survive long enough to lead. This was the environment that shaped Machiavelli's thinking, a world where good intentions often led to failure and harsh decisions often secured survival, a world where appearances mattered as much as actions, and where fear could sometimes achieve what love could not. And, perhaps most importantly, a world that taught him one brutal truth: power does not reward those who are right. It rewards those who are prepared. Everything Machiavelli would later write, every controversial idea, every misunderstood principle, was rooted in this reality. Because he was not imagining how power works. He was describing exactly what he had seen. For all the knowledge, influence, and proximity to power that Niccolò Machiavelli had gained, there was one truth he understood better than most. Power is never permanent. And then one day, he experienced that truth himself. In 1512, everything changed. The Medici family, who had once ruled Florence, returned to power with the support of foreign forces. The republic that Machiavelli had served so loyally collapsed almost overnight. The system he had worked within, believed in, and helped maintain was gone, and with it, so was his position. Machiavelli was dismissed from office, stripped of his authority, and removed from the political world he had dedicated his life to. But losing his job was only the beginning. Soon after, he was accused of being involved in a conspiracy against the Medici rulers. Whether he was guilty or not didn't matter. In a world driven by suspicion and control, accusation alone was enough. He was arrested, imprisoned, interrogated, and then came something far more brutal. He was tortured, not because he had been proven guilty, but because power needed to send a message. The man who once observed politics from within was now experiencing its darkest side. After weeks of suffering, Machiavelli was eventually released. But freedom did not mean restoration. It meant exile. He was banished from Florence, forced to leave behind everything: his career, his influence, his identity. He retreated to the countryside, to a quiet life far removed from the political chaos he once navigated. For a man who had spent years at the center of power, this silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. Imagine understanding the game better than most, but no longer being allowed to play it. Imagine seeing the patterns of power so clearly, but having no voice, no platform, no authority. This was Machiavelli's reality. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while exile destroyed his position, it sharpened his perspective. Stripped of responsibility, free from political pressure, and distance from the noise of power, Machiavelli began to reflect deeply on everything he had witnessed. The rise of leaders, the fall of governments, the betrayals, the strategies, the illusions. All of it started to connect. And in that isolation, something powerful began to form. Not a plan for revenge, not a return to politics, but an idea. An idea that would outlive the rulers who exiled him. An idea that would define his legacy. And an idea that would make the world both fear and misunderstand him for centuries. Because sometimes a man loses everything, not to disappear, but to create something the world is not ready for. Exile did not silence Niccolò Machiavelli. It transformed him, cut off from the world of politics, living in a quiet countryside, far from the power he once navigated. Machiavelli found himself in a position few truly understand. A man who had seen everything, now left with nothing but time to think, but he did not waste that time. During the day he lived a simple life, surrounded by routine and isolation. But at night, everything changed. He would dress in formal clothes, as if preparing to enter a royal court and sit down to write. Not as a politician anymore, but as an observer of truth. This was not just writing. This was reflection, analysis, and something deeper, an attempt to decode the hidden mechanics of power itself. And from that process, one of the most controversial books in history was born, The Prince. But to understand this book, you have to understand its purpose. Machiavelli did not write The Prince as a philosophical dream. He did not write about how leaders should behave in a perfect world. Instead, he wrote about how leaders actually behave in an imperfect one. He broke a long tradition of idealistic thinking. Before him, most political writers focused on morality, justice, and virtue. They described the kind of ruler people hoped to have. But Machiavelli did something radically different. He described the kind of ruler who would survive. He wrote about fear and love, arguing that while it is ideal for a ruler to be both, if forced to choose, it is safer to be feared than loved. Not because fear is noble, but because it is reliable. Love depends on emotion. Fear depends on consequence. He wrote about deception, not as a moral failure, but as a tool. A ruler, he argued, must learn to appear virtuous, even when he cannot afford to be, because people judge more by what they see than by what is true. He wrote about cruelty, not as chaos, but as calculation, that if harsh actions must be taken, they should be done swiftly and decisively, so stability can follow. To many, these ideas sounded dangerous, cold, ruthless, even immoral. But Machiavelli was not celebrating these traits. He was explaining them, and perhaps the most misunderstood part of The Prince is this. It was not just a book of observation. It was also a message. Machiavelli dedicated the work to the powerful Medici family, the same family that had removed him from power. Some believe this was an attempt to regain favor, to show his value, and to return to political life. But whether it was strategy, survival, or sincerity remains unclear. What is clear, however, is this. The Prince was never meant to comfort people. It was meant to confront them. It forced readers to face a reality they preferred to ignore. That power is not guided by ideals, but by results. That leaders are judged not by their intentions, but by their outcomes. And in doing so, Machiavelli crossed a line. He said out loud what others only practiced in silence. And that is why the book became so powerful and so dangerous. Because once you understand the rules of power, you can never unsee them. By the time Niccolò Machiavelli finished writing The Prince, he had done something few thinkers ever dared to do. He removed the mask from power, and the world did not forgive him for it. Almost immediately, his ideas began to spread, but not in the way he might have hoped. Instead of being seen as a sharp observer of political reality, Machiavelli was labeled something far darker. His name became associated with manipulation, deceit, and cold-hearted strategy. Over time, Machiavellian stopped being a description of his ideas and became an accusation. But here's the deeper truth that most people miss. Machiavelli was not creating a new kind of evil. He was describing an old one that already existed. The rulers he wrote about, the strategies he explained, the behaviors he analyzed. None of them were inventions. They were observations, patterns he had seen repeated again and again in real political life. But because he spoke about them openly, without moral decoration, people assumed he was promoting them. This is where the misunderstanding begins, because society often feels more comfortable with illusion than reality. People prefer leaders who appear virtuous, even if their actions suggest otherwise. They prefer to believe that power is guided by fairness and morality, even when history repeatedly proves the opposite. Machiavelli challenged that belief. He forced readers to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that power and morality are not always aligned, that a leader can be effective without being good, and good without being effective. And that idea was dangerous, not because it was new, but because it was honest. Think about it. If someone quietly manipulates behind the scenes, they are rarely questioned. But if someone explains exactly how manipulation works, step by step, they become a threat. Because knowledge removes illusion, and once illusion is gone, control becomes harder. This is exactly what happened to Machiavelli. He became the symbol of something people didn't want to admit existed. Instead of acknowledging the reality he described, it was easier to label him as the problem, to turn him into a villain rather than confront the system he exposed. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more complex. Machiavelli was not just a cold observer of power. He was also someone who deeply cared about his homeland. He wanted stability for Florence. He wanted strong leadership that could protect the state from internal chaos and external threats. His ideas were not born from a desire to corrupt, but from a desire to prevent collapse. He had seen what happens when leaders are too idealistic. He had seen governments fall because they refused to act decisively. He had seen how hesitation, kindness and moral purity, while admirable, could sometimes lead to destruction in a ruthless political environment. So he wrote what he believed was necessary, not what was comforting. And that is why he remains misunderstood even today. Because Machiavelli does not fit into simple categories, he is not purely a villain and not purely a hero. He is something far more unsettling, a man who held up a mirror to power and showed the world exactly what it looks like when no one is pretending. Long after Niccolò Machiavelli had faded from the political stage, his ideas refused to disappear. In fact, they grew stronger. Because while rulers came and went, empires rose and collapsed, one thing remained constant: the nature of power. And that is exactly what Machiavelli had captured in The Prince. Over the centuries, his work spread across Europe and beyond, quietly influencing leaders, thinkers, and strategists. Some studied his ideas in secret, afraid of being judged. Others embraced them openly, seeing in his words a practical guide to survival in a competitive world. But with influence came controversy. Many religious and moral institutions strongly rejected Machiavelli's ideas. The Catholic Church, for example, viewed his work as dangerous, even going as far as condemning it for promoting behavior that conflicted with moral teachings. To them, The Prince was not a reflection of reality, it was a threat to ethical order. And yet, despite criticism, the book continued to circulate, because even those who disagreed with Machiavelli could not ignore him. His ideas sparked debates that lasted for centuries. Philosophers argued over whether he was a realist or a cynic. Politicians questioned whether his strategies were necessary or destructive, and ordinary people remained divided, some seeing him as a genius, others as a symbol of everything wrong with power. But perhaps the most fascinating part of his legacy is this: even those who criticize Machiavelli often follow his principles without realizing it. Leaders still manage public perception carefully. They still balance fear and trust. They still make difficult decisions behind closed doors, decisions that may not always align with moral expectations, but serve a larger purpose of control or stability. In many ways, Machiavelli's ideas did not change the world. They revealed it, and that is why his legacy is so complex, because it forces a question that has no easy answer. Is it better for a leader to be morally right or strategically effective? Can power ever truly exist without compromise? And if the reality of leadership requires difficult, sometimes harsh decisions, should we blame the person who explains it or the system that demands it? Machiavelli never gave simple answers. Instead, he gave observations that continue to challenge, disturb, and influence the way people think about power even today. This is why his name has survived for over 500 years, not just as a historical figure, but as an idea, a symbol of realism in a world that often prefers illusion. Because no matter how much people argue against him, they cannot escape the truth he uncovered. The final years of Niccolò Machiavelli's life were marked by quiet reflection, isolation, and an ironic sense of unfinished business. After the turbulence of exile, imprisonment, and political betrayal, Machiavelli returned to Florence in relative obscurity. The city he had once served so loyally had changed, and the corridors of power he had once navigated with such skill were no longer open to him. During this period, he devoted himself entirely to writing and contemplation. He produced not only The Prince, but also other works, including Discourses on Livy and historical analyses of Florence, seeking to understand not just rulers, but the mechanisms of republics, civic virtue, and the forces that drive societies. Even in obscurity, his mind never stopped analyzing, connecting, and dissecting human behavior. His political philosophy was no longer just about survival, it was about leaving a record of truth for generations to come. Yet, despite his intellectual brilliance, he faced personal struggles, financial difficulties, fading influence, and the loneliness of a man whose ideas were too bold for his time weighed heavily on him. The very world he had tried to serve had turned away, misunderstanding his motives, vilifying his name, and judging him not by the depth of his insight, but by the fear his revelations inspired. Machiavelli's health began to decline, and in 1527, at the age of 58, he passed away in Florence. His death, however, did not mark the end of his impact. In life, he had been a servant of Florence, a diplomat, a scholar, and an exile. But in death, he became something far more enduring, a symbol of political realism, a mirror reflecting the unvarnished truth of power. It is worth noting the tragic irony of his final years. The man who had studied power so intimately, who had observed its rise and fall with unmatched clarity, never fully regained the influence he once wielded. Yet, by stepping back from the immediacy of politics, he gained something even greater, the timeless perspective that would allow his ideas to survive centuries, influencing leaders, thinkers, and scholars long after his voice had fallen silent. Machiavelli died misunderstood by the society he sought to guide, yet his life, work, and the harsh truths he revealed continue to shape the world's understanding of leadership, strategy, and human nature. His final years were quiet, but the legacy he left behind was explosive, an intellectual fire that no passing century could ever extinguish. The story of Niccolò Machiavelli is not one of simple triumph or defeat. It is the story of a man who lived in the cracks of power, who saw the machinery of politics in its rawest form, and who dared to speak truths that others either ignored or feared. From his rise within the Florentine Republic to his brutal fall, his exile, and finally the creation of the Prince, Machiavelli's life teaches us a timeless lesson. Understanding reality often requires courage, clarity, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Machiavelli's work continues to challenge our perceptions of morality, leadership, and human behavior. He reminds us that effective action often requires willingness more than idealism, requires insight, adaptability, and a keen awareness of consequences. His name has become synonymous with strategy and cunning, but beneath the label lies a thinker who sought to guide leaders through chaos, not corrupt them. The world may have misunderstood him in his lifetime, but history has proven the enduring power of his observations. As we reflect on his life, we see that Machiavelli's legacy is more than controversy. It is clarity. He forces us to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to lead effectively? How do ambition, fear, and loyalty shape our decisions? And how do we navigate a world where ideals often collide with reality? These are questions not just for rulers, but for anyone striving to understand human nature and the dynamics of influence in their own lives. So whether you are fascinated by history, politics, or the psychology of power, remember this: Machiavelli did not write to justify cruelty or manipulation. He wrote to reveal the hidden truths of leadership, to illuminate patterns too often ignored, and to prepare those willing to learn for the unpredictable world of human ambition. His life was a testament to resilience, observation, and intellect, a journey from the heart of power to exile, and ultimately to timeless influence. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the untold history of Niccolò Machiavelli. If you found this story as captivating as it is instructive, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss insights that reveal the hidden forces shaping history and human behavior. Dive deeper, question boldly, and always remember, true understanding often lies beneath the surface.